Well, today in your Grow group, you are going to be finishing your second pass through the book of Judges. You'll be reading the final 5 chapters together, where you'll look at those 2 stories which really demonstrate both the religious and moral decline of the nation of Israel until they become nothing more than the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, those 2 cities that God destroyed back in Abraham's day. In other words, the nation of Israel deserve the same punishment because they are just as sinful. And in these final 5 chapters, these final 2 stories, we don't get that same cycle that we've seen through the book of Judges that ended with the story of Samson. Instead, we get a different repeated phrase, which says, in those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw fit. This phrase is the only kind of commentary we get from the author about these stories. We get no other moral insight or moral notes. And so how should we interpret and understand this phrase? Well, it all depends when the book of Judges was written. Now, the book of Judges, the events in the book of Judges happen over a time period of 400 years. So there can be no one author. Instead, this is a compilation of written stories and oral traditions that were carefully collated and compiled by some editor or some editors into this cyclical structure that we have before us today. But when it was written, we cannot be sure. The earliest copies of the Old Testament scrolls that we have are the famous Dead Sea Scrolls, which date back to the 2nd and 3rd century BC. But this is later than the last events recorded in the Old Testament. So we don't really know how much of the Old Testament the people before the exile had access to. We know they had access to the Torah, the first 5 books. They're quoted throughout the Old Testament. But the books of Joshua, Judges, all the way through Malachi, we don't know if they were in regular circulation at that point. But this shouldn't worry us, because these scrolls are similar to the ones that Jesus would have read and studied and memorized and quoted from as he was quoting from the scriptures. But how does this idea of the timing of when the book of Judges was written help us to understand the phrase, Israel had no king? The obvious meaning of this phrase is that if we had a king to lead us, then everything would turn out better. If there was a king to lead the people in following God and following God's ways, then people wouldn't be doing as they saw fit in their own eyes. Everybody would be following this king as he follows the Lord and his law. And maybe if the editor of the book of Judges was writing close to the time of the Judges, then maybe this was his meaning. Maybe he looked at the situations through the book of Judges and thought, if only we could have a king to lead us in following God, then we'd be able to follow God's ways more closely. But the problem with this is that whenever the idea of kingship is mentioned in the book of Judges, it's either set aside very quickly or it turns out pretty bad for the people. Just look at the story of Abimelech. But the editor could have been meaning this with this phrase. But it could be that these stories in the book of Judges were compiled a lot later, maybe during the time of exile, when the people of Israel were being held captive in Babylon. If you read the books of 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, you'll see that a lot of the blame for the idolatry and apostasy of the nation of Israel was placed firmly in the laps of the kings. And this is really quite fair. They are the ones who had the authority, the might, and the power to remove all false worship from Israel. And a couple of them did. But more often than not, these kings were the chief followers and chief worshippers of these false gods. So maybe there were some Israelites who were captive in exile or after they returned, who reflected back on this time of the kings and said, if only we didn't have a king, then we'd be able to follow God ourselves without being led astray by these false leaders. But the editors of the book of Judges didn't want the people to fall into that trap of thinking either. And so by including this phrase, Israel had no king, The editor was saying that even in the days before the kings, when people had no king to follow, they still messed up and worshipped and followed other gods. The editor's saying that it's not about having a king, it's not about not having a king, because the problem is the human heart. And so our understanding of this phrase depends on when the book of Judges was written. But that's really hard to nail down. But I think both meanings of this phrase can be true. Human kings were responsible for the rebellion of Israel, but getting rid of human kings doesn't solve the problem of the human heart. And yes, for the people to truly follow God, they need to be led by a king. But that can't be some flawed human king, no matter how hard that king tries. The king that the people need to follow is God himself. The people were meant to live with God as their king. And the same is true for us today. We are meant to live our lives with Jesus as King and Lord over every aspect of our lives. And it's when we turn away from living with him as our king, is when we experience the brokenness and messiness that these people in the book of Judges faced as well. It might look a little different in our day, but it's still broken and messy. But God is also still a gracious God. And so today, as you read through these stories, I want you to be reflecting on this question. Am I living with Jesus as my king? Or am I doing as I see fit, doing what's right in my own eyes? And if you can honestly reflect and answer that question and think through the specific areas of your life where you do or do not follow Jesus as your king, then you'll be able to begin a journey of an ever deepening faith in and obedience to our great and glorious King, Jesus Christ.